Everyone said the millionaire had no heart, and they were right, until he fell for Sierra Lane, and she proved that the most powerful thing a woman can do isn't chase a man, but walk away from him 3 separate times, each exit teaching him that love doesn't heal broken people. It just makes them brave enough to heal themselves. Gabriel Cross accused her of exploitation when reporters ambushed her at his gates, watched her leave without defending herself because you wouldn't have believed me, then spent 3 months burying himself in work while she built a studio in Brooklyn and painted emotions in colors that had no names, until his assistant uncovered proof that his ex Amber had planted every leak, forged every document, orchestrated every scandal to eliminate the one woman who'd made Gabriel feel something in 12 years of emotional permafrost. But the real gut punch came when he showed up drenched in rain at her construction site holding evidence like an apology. And Sierra told him 5 words that rewrote everything he thought he knew about redemption. Some people just stay broken, then walked into the storm anyway, leaving him to discover that the hardest lesson wealth can't buy is learning whether someone who gave you a heart you never knew you needed will ever. Hey, my wonderful family, my heart is full of love for you. You're my light in every season. May heaven bless you with favor and joy. May every sunrise bring peace and every night bring rest. You are covered, chosen, and loved beyond words. Thank you for being part of this family. Subscribe and tell me where you're watching from. The story begins. The Cross Foundation Gala hummed beneath a dusky Manhattan sky, all champagne bubbles and calculated laughter, the kind of event where every smile had a price tag and every conversation was an investment. Crystal chandeliers cast amber light across walls lined with art that cost more than most people's houses, and everywhere, on every face, in every gesture, was the particular performance of people who'd learned to monetize their presence. Gabriel Cross stood at the center of it all in a white suit that photographed like armor, immaculate and unreadable. The millionaire the press loved to call the man with no pulse. Every camera flash loved him. Every investor feared him. Every woman in the room had calculated her approach and found it wanting, not because he was cruelly, but because his charm had the shelf life of a business transaction, warm enough to close deals, cold enough to close hearts. He moved through the crowd with practiced efficiency, shaking hands that wanted favors, accepting compliments that wanted contracts, existing in the particular limbo of men who'd learned that feeling nothing was safer than feeling anything at all. Then across the gallery, something disrupted his perfect detachment. A woman stood near the far wall, attention fixed not on the room's glittering elite, but on a damaged painting mounted between more pristine works. Her skin glowed bronze under amber light, curls brushing shoulders left bare by a simple dress that looked expensive only because of how confidently she wore it. She was clearly out of place among Manhattan's power brokers. No performance, no pretense. No awareness that she was the only person in the room looking at art instead of opportunity. Gabriel approached out of habit, curiosity disguised as control, the way he always moved toward things that didn't immediately make sense to him. "You're not bidding?" "Bidding?" he asked, tone smooth, rehearsed, the voice he used when charm was strategy. She glanced up, and for a fraction of a second their eyes met, hers dark and assessing, his pale and practiced at revealing nothing. "I restore things," she said simply. Tone cool but not cruel, matter of fact rather than flirtatious. "I don't buy them." Then she turned back to the painting, dismissing him with the kind of indifference that felt less like game playing and more like genuine disinterest. As if a millionaire's attention was just another interruption between her and the work she actually cared about. Gabriel stood there, frozen in a moment that shouldn't have mattered, watching her examine brushstrokes with the particular focus of someone who saw beauty in broken things, not as metaphor, but as vocation. "The craquelure is extensive," she murmured, more to herself than to him, fingers hovering near the canvas without touching. "Someone tried to restore this before but didn't understand the medium. They painted over damage instead of healing it." "Aren't they the same thing?" Gabriel asked, genuinely curious now, off script. She looked at him then, really looked, and something in her expression suggested she'd just made a calculation of her own. not about his wealth or his influence, but about whether he was worth explaining things to. Painting over damage is cosmetic, she said. Healing it means going back to the original wound, understanding what caused it, being patient enough to repair it properly even when it's easier to just cover it up. A pause. Most people choose the cover-up. It's faster. The words landed with weight Gabriel wasn't prepared for, as if she was talking about more than paint and canvas, as if she'd somehow diagnosed something about him in 30 seconds that therapists had failed to reach in years. "And you?" he asked. "Which do you choose?" "The slow way," she answered. "Always, even when it hurts." Then before he could respond, before he could deploy the charm or the control or the carefully rehearsed lines that usually kept conversations orbiting his gravity, she walked away, not rudely, not dramatically, just purposefully, as if their exchange had reached its natural conclusion and standing there performing small talk was less interesting than studying damaged art. Her heels clicked against marble, each step echoing louder than the applause that usually followed him. And Gabriel Cross, the man who never got ignored, who never felt surprised, who'd spent 12 years building an empire from emotional permafrost, felt something stir in the cavity where his heart used to live. Not attraction exactly, not even interest in the romantic sense, just recognition. She was real. Everyone else in this room was performing wealth, performing connection, performing the particular dance of people who'd learned to monetize their humanity. But she'd looked at him like he was just another person interrupting her work, like his money was boring, like his charm was transparent, like the only thing that mattered was whether he understood the difference between covering damage and healing it. And he didn't. He'd spent 12 years painting over his grief instead of feeling it, building walls from his mother's death instead of processing it, choosing control over connection because control didn't shatter when you needed it most. Gabriel pulled out his phone, texted his assistant, "Get me everything on Sierra Lane, Art Restorer, tonight." The response came back within minutes. A file, a portfolio, a history. Sierra Lane, 32, independent restoration specialist, reputation for being brilliant and difficult in equal measure. Turned down high-profile commissions if the client wanted fast results over authentic restoration. Lived in a Brooklyn studio that probably cost a fraction of what Gabriel spent monthly on dry cleaning. No social media presence. No apparent interest in networking her way into Manhattan's elite circles. And buried in the final paragraph, a detail that made Gabriel's pulse quicken despite himself. Currently commissioned by the Cross Estate Trust to restore a work from your private collection. Board approved, contract already signed. He read it twice, something cold sliding through his chest. The Cross Estate Trust, his mother's posthumous meddling, the foundation she'd established with ironclad instructions that not even her son could override. You're in. For 12 years, that trust had been dormant, its one remaining task incomplete, the restoration of the Silent Son, the painting Gabriel had locked in storage the day after her funeral, the portrait he'd forbidden anyone to touch because touching it meant confronting everything he had spent 12 years avoiding. And they'd hired her, the woman who believed in healing damage instead of covering it up, the woman who'd just walked away from him without asking for anything. Gabriel looked across the gallery to where Sierra had been standing. She was gone, disappeared into the crowd or maybe out the door entirely, moving forward the way she seemed to move through everything, purposefully, independently, without looking back to see if anyone followed. By midnight, her name was on his desk in a file that felt heavier than paper. By the end of the month, she'd be the one person who dared to tell him the truth. And by the end of the year, she'd be gone, leaving him with a heart he never meant to have. Gabriel arrived at the restoration studio at 7 a.m., too early for courtesy, too angry for patience. He'd spent the night reading his mother's trust documents with the particular fury of a man discovering he'd been outmaneuvered by a ghost. The instructions were clear, legally airtight, impossible to override. The Silent Son was to be restored by a qualified specialist of the trust's choosing, with full access and complete autonomy, regardless of the current owner's preferences. His mother, even in death, still knew exactly how to make him face the things he'd rather keep locked away. The studio occupied a converted warehouse in Red Hook, all exposed brick in northern light, the kind of space that prioritized function over aesthetic. Industrial shelving lined with restoration supplies, work tables scarred by decades of careful violence, the air thick with the smell of linseed oil and turpentine. Sierra's domain, he realized immediately, was the opposite of his carefully curated world. Nothing here was for show. Everything was for work. He found her at a table near the windows, already bent over the silent sun, a magnifying glass in one hand and a scalpel in the other, wearing paint-stained overalls that somehow looked more intentional than the gala dress from the night before. She didn't look up when he entered, didn't acknowledge the door slamming with more force than necessary, just continued her examination with the particular focus of someone who'd learned to ignore interruptions. "This stops," Gabriel said without preamble. "Whatever contract you signed, I'll buy you out of it. Name your price." Sierra set down the magnifying glass with deliberate calm. When she finally looked at him, her expression carried none of the surprise or intimidation he'd expected. "I didn't expect," just mild annoyance, as if he were a persistent telemarketer rather than the man who technically owned the painting she was touching. "Good morning to you too," she said evenly. "And no, you don't understand. I understand perfectly. You don't want this painting restored because it means something you're not ready to confront." She picked up the magnifying glass again. "But your mother's trust hired me specifically because I don't take shortcuts, and I don't stop work just because it makes people uncomfortable. If you wanted it untouched, you shouldn't have hired someone to heal it." The words landed like the ones from the night before. Not aggressive, just true, the kind of truth that felt like exposure. Gabriel moved closer, jaw tight. "My mother didn't hire you. She's been dead for 12 years. Then she planned very well." Sierra gestured to the painting. "The trust's instructions are specific. Restore the silent sun to its original state, regardless of subsequent damage or alterations, which means I remove everything that wasn't part of the original composition, including whatever someone painted over this corner section about 15 years ago." She indicated an area near the bottom right where the brushwork looked subtly different from the rest, where colors didn't quite match, where someone had clearly tried to hide something beneath a hasty repair work. "Don't," Gabriel said, voice dropping to something that might have been threat or might have been plea. "That section doesn't need—" But Sierra had already applied solvent to a cotton swab, already begun the careful work of removing layers, her movements precise and unhurried despite the tension crackling through the studio like static. "This is what I do," she said quietly, not looking at him. "I uncover what's been hidden. I restore what's been damaged. I don't make judgments about whether the truth is convenient." Gabriel watched, frozen between anger and something closer to dread, as the solvent dissolved paint that had been there longer than some of his employees had been alive. Watched as Sierra's hand moved with the particular confidence of someone who'd done this 1,000 times, who understood that healing required exposure first, that you couldn't restore beauty without confronting what had been covered up. Then she stopped. Her hand hovered above the canvas, magnifying glass positioned over something Gabriel couldn't see from where he stood. The silence stretched for 3 seconds that felt like hours. "There are initials here," she said, voice carefully neutral. "Faint, under the repair work. AC." The studio tilted. Those letters, that signature, the scandal his father had tried to bury, that his mother had never confirmed or denied, that had shattered his childhood into before and after, before he understood that his mother had loved someone else, and after, when trust became something he rationed instead of gave. Gabriel's composure, so carefully maintained for 12 years, cracked down the center like cheap porcelain. He didn't say anything, couldn't say anything, just turned and walked out, the door closing behind him with the quiet finality of something ending, leaving Sierra alone with the painting in the sudden, uncomfortable understanding that she hadn't just removed paint. She'd scraped open a wound that had been festering for over a decade, hidden beneath brushstrokes and silence, and a millionaire's carefully constructed armor. Sierra set down her tools with trembling hands, staring at the initials she'd uncovered, essayed and understanding for the first time that some restorations weren't about art at all. They were about forcing people to face the truths they'd been covering up their entire lives. And she'd just done exactly that to a man who'd spent 12 years perfecting the art of feeling nothing. Days stretched into late nights at the restoration studio, and Gabers kept appearing under increasingly transparent pretenses. Checking progress, he'd say, standing in the doorway like he wasn't sure whether he was allowed to enter his own property. Sierra would glance up from her work, offer a brief nod, and return to the meticulous process of healing what had been broken, never asking why he came, never commenting on the fact that he stayed longer each time, watching her work with the particular intensity of someone trying to understand a language they'd never learned to speak. She began to see past the armor. The cold precision was exhaustion wearing a better suit. The clipped responses were guilt that had calcified over years of not knowing how to process it. The distance he maintained wasn't cruelty. It was loneliness so profound it had become identity, the kind that made connection feel more dangerous than isolation. One evening, as amber light filtered through the warehouse windows and painted everything the color of memory, Sierra set down her brush and asked softly, "Did she ever finish this piece?" Gabriel stood near the window, silhouette against fading daylight, silent for so long she thought he might not answer. Then, without turning, without inflection, "She died before she could." The words hung in the air like smoke. Sierra didn't press, didn't offer hollow comfort, just returned to her work, understanding that some truths needed space to breathe, that the best response to grief was sometimes just witnessing it without trying to fix it. That night, Gabriel dreamed of his mother for the first time in years, not the sanitized memories he'd constructed to make her death bearable, but something rawer, more real. She stood before an unfinished canvas, smiling through fractured glass, and when he reached for her, the glass shattered into 1,000 pieces that rearranged themselves into Sierra's face. He woke at 3 a.m. with his heart racing, unable to separate the two women, unable to understand why the art restorer, who'd been in his life for barely a week, felt somehow connected to the mother he'd lost 12 years ago. Both of them saw beauty in broken things. Both of them believed in healing over hiding. Both of them looked at him like he was human instead of a balance sheet. The thought terrified him more than any business deal ever had. At the staff meeting Tuesday morning, Amber Collins noticed his distraction immediately. She'd built her entire career in Gabriel's shadow, learned to read his moods better than market trends, positioned herself as the indispensable one, the woman who understood how his empire worked because she'd helped build it, who knew where all the strategic bodies were buried because she'd helped bury them. "Gabriel?" she said, voice carrying just enough concern to sound professional. "The Merino contract?" He blinked, realizing he'd been staring at the conference room window instead of the presentation. Thoughts somewhere in Red Hook, watching a woman restore paint with the kind of focus he used to think he'd reserved exclusively for profit margins. "Approved," he said curtly. "Move forward." After the meeting, Amber lingered, heels clicking against marble as she approached his office. "You seem distracted lately." "I'm fine. Is it the restoration project?" "I heard you've been spending time at the studio." Her smile was practiced sympathy, but her eyes were calculation. "I know that painting is difficult for you. If you need me to handle the oversight—" "No." Too sharp, he softened it with effort. "It's under control." But Amber had already seen what she needed to see. Gabriel Cross, the man who never let emotion interfere with business, was being distracted by a woman who restored broken things for a living. Her lips tightened into something that might have been a smile if smiles could carry threat. She'd built everything she had by being the woman Gabriel needed. She wasn't about to let some Brooklyn art restorer steal the light she'd spent 5 years positioning herself beneath. Sierra arrived at Cross Enterprises Thursday afternoon with preliminary restoration photos, expecting a brief handoff to Gabriel's assistant. Instead, she found a wall of reporters camped outside the gate, cameras swinging toward her the moment she stepped from the cab. "Ms. Lane, is it true you're dating Gabriel Cross? How much is he paying you for the restoration? Are you exploiting his mother's memory for publicity?" The questions came like artillery, flashbulbs exploding, voices overlapping into incomprehensible noise. Sierra stood frozen, understanding dawning with nauseating clarity. Someone had leaked her identity, weaponized her work, turned a restoration project into tabloid ammunition. The Millionaire's new Mew, one headline screamed from a phone thrust in her face. She pushed through security, heart pounding, makeup folder clutched to her chest like armor. The elevator ride up felt like descending into cold water. Pressure building, air thinning, the particular dread of knowing you're about to be judged for something you didn't do. Gabriel's office was steel and glass and the kind of view that cost more than most people's annual salaries. He stood at the window, back to the door, posture rigid. "Tell me you didn't stage this," he said without turning, voice carved from ice. Sierra's breath caught. "What?" "The media circus. Very convenient timing, right when you're scheduled to present preliminary work." He finally turned, face unreadable, eyes empty of the warmth she'd glimpsed in the studio. "Everyone wants something, Sierra. I just thought you'd be more subtle about it." "You really think—" She stopped, recalibrated, forced her voice to stay level even though fury was burning through her chest. "You really think I'd humiliate myself to get close to you? That I'd let reporters turn my work into a punchline for what? Access to your money? Your attention?" "Everyone wants something," he repeated, quieter now, but somehow more cutting. "Not me." Sierra set the folder on his desk with controlled precision. "I don't look back, remember? And I sure as hell don't chase men who think everyone's playing an angle." She headed for the door, each step deliberate. "The preliminary photos are in the folder. The restoration is 80% complete. I'll finish it, deliver it, and then you'll never have to worry about whether I'm trying to exploit you again." Sierra, but she was already gone. The door closing with the quiet finality of something ending before it had properly begun. Gabriel stood alone in his office, the folder untouched on his desk, and realized with crushing clarity that he'd just made a mistake. That his default assumption, "everyone wants something," had just cost him the one person who genuinely wanted nothing from him except the space to do honest work. But pride kept him silent. Pride in the ingrained certainty that admitting mistakes meant admitting vulnerability, and vulnerability meant getting destroyed. In the hallway, Amber Collins watched Sierra leave, satisfaction glittering in her eyes like cut glass catching light. She'd planted the leak perfectly. Anonymous tip to 3 gossip sites, accompanied by photos of Gabriel's car at the Red Hook studio. Speculation about late-night visits and mysterious new relationship. Not enough to be traced back to her, but more than enough to poison whatever was growing between them. Some threats required elimination before they became problems. And Sierra Lane had just been eliminated. Weeks passed like wounds healing badly, painful, slow, leaving scars in places that shouldn't have needed them. Gabriel buried himself in work the way he always had, filling 18-hour days with meetings and contracts, and the comfortable numbness of treating life like a spreadsheet. But every boardroom reflection showed Sierra's face. Every silent moment echoed with her voice. "I don't look back." Every evening found him staring at the preliminary restoration photos she'd left, seeing not just his mother's painting, but the woman who'd understood what healing actually required. Mark Weston, his assistant of 8 years, knocked on his office door at 11 p.m. on a Tuesday, holding a tablet with the particular expression of someone delivering news their boss wouldn't want to hear. "You need to see this," Mark said, pulling up an email chain. It flagged it during a routine audit. The leak to the press. It came from inside the company. Gabriel's pulse quickened. "Show me." The evidence was damning. Emails from Amber's account to 3 gossip sites, photos taken from her phone's metadata, payment authorizations for media consultation that lined up perfectly with the day Sierra had been ambushed. Professional, calculated, designed to look like concerned oversight while systematically destroying someone's reputation. For the first time in 12 years, Gabriel felt something beyond anger or numbness. He felt fear, not fear of exposure, not fear of business consequences, fear that he'd judged someone innocent, that his default assumption of ulterior motives had just cost him someone who'd genuinely seen him as human rather than opportunity, that he might be fundamentally unworthy of the forgiveness he'd need to ask for, fear that he'd become exactly what everyone said he was, a man with no heart. Meanwhile, across the river in a small Brooklyn studio, with paint-stained floors and windows that overlooked nothing impressive, Sierra painted for the first time in months. Not commissions, not restorations, but emotions she couldn't articulate any other way. Grief rendered in indigo, distance captured in gray. Love unspoken bleeding across canvas in shades that had no names. Her best friend Lena arrived with coffee and concern, taking one look at the canvas and saying what Sierra couldn't. "You miss him." "I miss the version of him I thought existed," Sierra corrected, not looking up from her work. "The one who could see people as more than transactions." "So call him. Explain what happened." "He wouldn't believe it." Sierra set down her brush. "He didn't believe me when I was standing right in front of him telling the truth." "Why would distance change that?" "Because maybe he realized he was wrong." "He didn't believe me because he doesn't believe in people," Sierra said quietly. "He spent so long protecting himself from feeling anything that trust became impossible." "I can't fix that, Lena. I can barely fix paintings." But destiny, as it turned out, wasn't finished with them yet, because the next morning a courier would arrive with a single envelope containing no apology, just an evidence, a check made out to her with payment for damages in the memo line, and 5 words in Gabriel's handwriting that would change everything. "I know it was Amber." The New Cross Foundation wing rose from Manhattan concrete like a promise half kept, scaffolding against twilight, windows not yet installed, the skeleton of something that might become beautiful if anyone had the patience to finish it. Sierra worked on the central wall late into a Tuesday evening, surrounded by paint cans in the particular solitude of spaces under construction, creating a mural the board had commissioned without telling her whose foundation she was painting for. She'd learned that detail 3 days in, considered walking away, then decided that punishing herself for Gabriel's mistakes was just another way of letting him control her story. So she stayed, painting what the board had requested, a heart reconstructed from shattered glass, each fragment catching light differently, the cracks visible but somehow making the whole more beautiful than perfection ever could. The storm arrived without warning, spring thunder that shook the unfinished walls, rain that found every gap in the temporary roof, and turned the construction site into an archipelago of puddles reflecting work lights. Sierra kept painting, jacket soaked, hair plastered to her face, too absorbed in the work to care about comfort. She was detailing the final fragment, the piece that would complete the heart or prove it irreparable, when she heard footsteps behind her. "You should be inside," she said without turning. "Rain and electrical work don't mix well." "Neither do storms and painting, apparently." Gabriel's voice carried from the doorway, rough with something that might have been exhaustion or emotion. "But you're still here." Sierra's brush paused mid-stroke. She hadn't seen him since the office confrontation 5 weeks ago, hadn't expected to see him again, beyond whatever professional interactions the mural required. Slowly, she turned. He stood in the unfinished entrance, drenched despite the umbrella he held like a prop in a play he didn't know the lines for. His suit, probably worth more than her monthly rent, was ruined, water dripping from expensive fabric onto construction-grade concrete. But what struck her most was his face. The careful emptiness had cracked, replaced by something rawer, more desperate, more human than she'd ever seen him look. "Why didn't you tell me the truth?" he asked, not moving closer, voice barely audible over the rain drumming against tarps. "About Amber. About the leak. You could have explained. You wouldn't have believed it." Sierra set down her brush with deliberate calm, each movement designed to hide the way her heart was suddenly racing. "You'd already decided I was like everyone else, opportunistic, manipulative, playing an angle. What would my explanation have changed?" "I would now," he said quietly. "I would believe you now." Thunder rolled through the space between them. Sierra laughed, bitter, tired. "Because you have evidence? Because your assistant found emails that proved I was telling the truth? That's not belief, Gabriel. That's just having your suspicions confirmed by data you trust more than people. That's not fair." I said, "Fair." She turned back to the mural, picking up her brush again even though her hands were shaking. "You know what's not fair? Spending 3 weeks restoring a painting that meant something, watching you slowly start to trust me, beginning to believe that maybe the man everyone said had no heart was just someone who'd learned to protect it. And then having you look at me like I was another transaction the second things got complicated. I made a mistake. You made a choice. Her voice stayed level, controlled, even as something inside her was screaming. You chose to believe the worst about me because it was safer than risking that I might actually be different. That's not a mistake, Gabriel. That's a pattern. And I can't. She stopped, breathed. I'm not here to fix you. Some people just stay broken. The words landed like the ones she'd said at the gala weeks ago, true enough to hurt, gentle enough not to be cruel. Gabriel stood in the doorway, umbrella forgotten, rain soaking through what was left of his composure. What if I don't want to stay broken? His voice cracked on the last word. Sierra turned to face him fully then, and he saw what he'd been too defended to see before. She wasn't angry. She was just tired. Tired of being doubted. Tired of watching someone she'd started to care about choose fear over trust. Tired of hoping that love could heal wounds people weren't ready to acknowledge. Then you heal yourself, she said softly. You stop covering damage and start feeling it. You learn to trust people, not because data tells you to, but because trust is the only way to actually live. You rebuild, not because someone's fixing you, but because you finally decide you're worth saving. She gathered her supplies, movements efficient, final. I'm not your restoration project, Gabriel. I'm not a painting you can pay someone to heal while you watch from a safe distance. I'm a person, and I deserve someone who doesn't need proof before they believe I'm telling the truth. She walked past him, careful not to touch, careful not to let him see how much leaving hurt. Her footsteps echoed in the empty space, mixing with rain, becoming part of the storm. Sierra, he called after her, but she kept walking out into the rain, disappearing into the night the way she'd disappeared from his office 5 weeks ago. Not running, not dramatic, just moving forward. Because forward was the only direction she knew how to go. Gabriel stood in the doorway long after she'd vanished, watching rain blur her reflection in the puddles, until even that was gone. And for the first time in 12 years, for the first time since his mother's funeral, he felt what loss truly sounded like. Not the crash of grief he'd experienced at 19. Not the empty numbness he'd built his empire around. Just silence. Complete, devastating, honest silence. The sound of someone walking away and taking the only thing that had made him feel human in over a decade. The Cross Foundation's grand reopening drew Manhattan's elite the way galas always did. Champagne, cameras, the particular performance of people who'd learned to monetize their generosity. The new wing gleamed under stage lights, every surface reflecting wealth and careful curation. The crowd murmuring appreciation for architecture that cost more than small hospitals. Sierra stood backstage in a simple black dress, watching through the curtain as donors congratulated themselves for funding art that would never be seen by the communities who most needed it. The board had insisted she attend the unveiling, had even offered to fly her in from wherever she'd been hiding, their words, not hers, as if her 3-month absence had been avoidance rather than self-preservation. She'd almost declined, almost sent a polite email saying her work spoke for itself and she'd prefer not to become part of the spectacle. But then she'd thought about the mural she'd painted, the heart reconstructed from shattered glass, and realized that running from moments that made her uncomfortable was just another way of covering wounds instead of healing them. So she came, stood backstage, and waited for the unveiling that would mark the end of her connection to Gabriel Cross and everything he represented. The foundation director took the microphone, launching into a speech about vision and legacy and the transformative power of art. Sierra tuned out the corporate poetry, focusing instead on the covered mural behind him, wondering if the heart she'd painted would read as hopeful or just broken in different ways. Then Amber Collins stepped into the spotlight. Sierra's pulse quickened. Amber, who hadn't been mentioned in any of the evening's programming, who'd supposedly been let go from Cross Enterprises months ago under circumstances the press had speculated about but never confirmed. Amber wearing designer armor and a smile that looked like calculation wrapped in concern. "I'm sorry to interrupt," Amber said, voice projecting perfectly. Practiced sympathy that played well to cameras. "But I have information the board needs to hear before celebrating this wing. Information about the artist behind that mural." The crowd shifted, whispers spreading like infection. Gabriel, Sierra noticed from her vantage point, had gone completely still in the front row, jaw tight, hands gripping his chair's arms. Ms. Lane, Amber continued, pulling documents from her clutch with theatrical precision, destroyed evidence during her restoration of the Silent Sun. These receipts show she billed for materials never purchased, forged authentication records, and, she paused for effect, deliberately damaged the original painting to extend her contract and maximize profit. Gasps rippled through the elite. Cameras swung towards Sierra. The foundation director's face went pale. Sierra stood frozen backstage, watching her reputation get dismantled by someone who'd spent 5 years perfecting the art of strategic destruction, understanding with awful clarity that this was how careers ended, not with mistakes, but with accusations made in rooms full of people predisposed to believe the worst about artists they'd never bothered to actually know. Then Detective Harper stepped forward. Sierra recognized her from the investigation into the original media leak, a woman in her 50s with gray-streaked hair and the particular presence of people who had spent decades separating truth from performance. She moved to the microphone with unhurried confidence, holding her own folder, expression unreadable. "Actually, Ms. Collins," Harper said, voice cutting through whispers with authority that needed no amplification, "the forgery is yours." The room turned. All of it, every camera, every face, every ounce of attention that had been focused on destroying Sierra, suddenly pivoting toward Amber. "These documents," Harper continued, displaying them on the projection screen, "were created using Ms. Collins's computer at Cross Enterprises, printed on company letterhead she had access to, and backdated to coincide with Lane's restoration work. We've also confirmed that Ms. Collins orchestrated the media leak 5 months ago, paid 3 gossip sites to run stories framing Ms. Lane as exploitative, and attempted to blackmail Mr. Cross using fabricated evidence of financial impropriety." Amber's composure fractured like cheap glass. I would never. Gabriel, tell them." But Gabriel wasn't looking at her. He was staring at the folder in Harper's hands with an expression that might have been fury or might have been grief or might have been both. Security materialized from the wings. Amber's protests escalated into panic as they escorted her toward the exit, her designer heels clicking against marble like a countdown, the crowd parting to let her pass with the particular cruelty of people who just watched someone fall from grace in real time. Sierra stood under the stage lights, summoned there by the director during the chaos, exhausted but unbroken, feeling not vindication but the hollow relief of someone who'd survived an assassination attempt on her character and was still processing whether survival counted as victory. Gabriel approached the microphone. No script, no PR polish, just a man who looked like he'd spent months learning a language he didn't have words for yet. "For years," he said, voice rough, carrying to the back of the room, "I thought having a heart was weakness, that feeling things made you vulnerable. That trust was just another word for eventual betrayal." He paused, looking directly at Sierra for the first time since she'd walked away in the rain 3 months ago. "Then someone showed me it's not weakness. It's the only thing worth protecting. The only thing that makes any of this," he gestured around the foundation, "mean anything beyond tax write-offs and good press." Applause rose, tentative at first, then building. But Sierra wasn't listening to the crowd. She was watching Gabriel's face, seeing something she'd glimpsed in the Red Hook studio, but had been too defended to trust, actual feeling, unfiltered by a strategy, raw enough to be honest. "Ms. Lane," he said, quieter now, though the microphone still carried it, "created something in this wing that I couldn't, art that shows how broken things can be beautiful, how cracks can catch light in ways perfection never could. She did it while I was questioning her integrity, doubting her motives, choosing fear over trust. The fact that she finished this work despite that says more about her character than anything I could say up here." He stepped back from the microphone, the kind of exit that suggested he'd said all he came to say, and anything more would be performance. The director fumbled with the unveiling ceremony, pulling the cloth from Sierra's mural with hands that still shook from the drama. The crowd gasped again, but this time in genuine awe rather than scandal. The heart she'd painted filled the entire wall, each glass fragment rendered in meticulous detail, cracks visible but catching light in ways that made them look less like damage and more like proof that something had been worth breaking for. Not hiding the wounds, not pretending they didn't exist. Just showing that healing didn't require perfection, it just required the courage to keep reflecting light despite the fractures. Applause thundered through the space. Critics were already taking photos. Donors were making notes about commissioning similar pieces. But Sierra simply stepped away from the spotlight, moving toward the exit with the same quiet purposefulness she'd used to walk out of Gabriel's office, out of the construction site, out of every situation where staying would have meant compromising who she'd become. Gabriel watched her go, not following this time, not calling after her, just watching, learning maybe what she'd been trying to teach him from the beginning, that some people don't need to be chased. They need to be trusted enough to come back on their own terms, or not come back at all. And both choices need to be okay. Months passed the way seasons do, slowly, then suddenly, marking time through changes too subtle to notice until you looked back and realized everything was different. Sierra's studio thrived in quiet ways. No massive contracts or gallery representation, just word-of-mouth commissions from people who valued restoration over speed, healing over cosmetic fixes. She turned down interviews about the foundation drama, refused offers to monetize the scandal, kept her head down and her work honest the way she'd always done. She painted in the mornings before the light got too harsh, taught free restoration workshops to Brooklyn kids on weekends, lived the kind of life that would never make headlines but felt more real than anything wealth could buy. One evening in late autumn, she found a cream envelope under her door. No return address, no name, just expensive stationery that felt like apology without words. Inside, a check made out to Brooklyn Youth Arts Initiative, an organization that didn't exist yet, but would if someone with this much money decided to fund it. The amount was staggering, life-changing, the kind of philanthropy that would give hundreds of kids access to art supplies, studio space, mentorship from working artists. The signature read only, anonymous. But Sierra knew. Of course she knew. Gabriel hadn't asked for her back, hadn't sent flowers or written letters or done any of the grand gestures romantic movies insisted were proof of transformation. He'd just, well, given something to the world, created opportunity for kids who needed it, used his wealth for something that mattered beyond tax benefits or good press. Not for her, for them, for the communities she'd built her life around. That night, Sierra pulled out a fresh canvas and painted for the first time in weeks. Not a commission, not a restoration, just emotion rendered in colors that had no names. When she finished, she signed the corner with two words that felt like closure and continuation simultaneously. Still forward, the Cross Foundation's exhibition Hearts in Motion opened on a Thursday evening in February, almost a year after the night Sierra had walked into Gabriel's life and taught him the difference between covering wounds and healing them. She attended quietly, deliberately late, wearing a simple coat that let her blend into the crowd of art enthusiasts and critics who'd come to see how Manhattan's elite were spinning emotional vulnerability into the season's trending aesthetic. Sierra moved through galleries like a ghost, studying other people's interpretations of hearts and healing, finding most of them too clean, too resolved, too eager to present brokenness as something you got over instead of something you learned to live with beautifully. Then she reached the final gallery. The room had been designed like a conclusion, small, intimate, lit to emphasize a single piece mounted on the far wall. Sierra moved closer, breath catching, recognizing the painting immediately. The silent sun, but not as she'd left it. Someone had finished it, added brushstrokes to sections she'd planned to leave bare, completed the composition in ways that honored her work while adding something undeniably new. The technique was uncertain, the hand of someone learning rather than someone practiced, but the emotion was unmistakable. Grief transformed into acceptance, loss rendered as memory instead of wound. A conversation between two artists separated by death and decades in the particular distance that comes from never quite knowing how to say goodbye. Gabriel had finished his mother's painting, not by hiring someone, by doing it himself. The plaque beneath read, for the girl who taught me to look forward. Sierra stood in front of it for a long time, understanding flooding through her. Not forgiveness exactly, not reconciliation, just recognition that healing wasn't linear, that people could change without erasing what they'd done. That moving forward sometimes meant acknowledging how far you'd actually come. I didn't expect to see you here, a voice said softly behind her as she turned. Gabriel stood in the gallery entrance wearing a simple suit, no entourage, no cameras, no armor except whatever he'd managed to build from 12 months of learning how to feel things he'd spent years avoiding. He looked different, tired maybe, but the kind of tired that came from effort rather than emptiness. I didn't expect to ever feel again, he said, moving closer but maintaining distance, respecting the space she'd claimed. But apparently you don't get to choose what changes you. You just get to choose what you do about it. They stood together in the quiet gallery, the painting between them like evidence of everything they'd survived separately. You finished it, Sierra said finally, gesturing to the canvas. Badly, he admitted, but I finished it. Took me 8 months and a dozen YouTube tutorials and more patience than I knew I had, but I couldn't. I couldn't leave it the way it was. Incomplete. A conversation she never got to finish. He paused. I thought maybe if I could finish this, I could learn how to actually heal instead of just covering things up. And did you learn? I mean, I'm learning. Gabriel smiled faintly, genuine, uncertain, human. Still not great at it. Still default to spreadsheets when feelings get complicated. But I'm trying, went to therapy, apologized to people I'd hurt, started actually running the foundation instead of just funding it, even learned to paint, apparently, though learned might be generous. Sierra studied his additions to the painting, clumsy in technique but honest in emotion, the work of someone who'd finally stopped pretending he didn't need to heal. Everyone said the millionaire had no heart, she whispered, testing the words, feeling how they'd changed shape over the year between them. Gabriel looked at her then, really looked, the way he had in the Red Hook studio before fear had made him cruel. They were right, until he gave it away to someone who taught him it wasn't weakness to have one. Gave it away? Sierra's smile was faint, careful. That's a very permanent verb. Was it? His voice carried hope and uncertainty in equal measure. Because I thought maybe, if you were interested in restorations that take a really long time, that require patience and won't ever be perfect, but might be worth the effort anyway. Gabriel, she interrupted gently, I'm not here to fix you. I know. He didn't move closer, didn't reach for her, just stood in the space between them and let the honesty exist. I don't need fixing. I'd like someone to move forward with. If you're interested, no pressure, no expectations, just possibility. Sierra looked at the painting, at the brushstrokes that showed two people trying to complete something. Neither could finish alone, at the visible cracks that somehow made it more beautiful than perfection ever could have been. I'm still painting, she said, still teaching, still building the kind of life that won't fit into galas or foundations or the world you built. Good, Gabriel said simply. I don't want you to fit. I want to learn how to exist in the same space without requiring either of us to be smaller. The lights in the gallery dimmed slightly. The museum's signal that closing was approaching, that all beautiful things eventually had to end or transform into something new. Sierra turned to face him fully, and for the first time in a year, she didn't walk away. Moving forward doesn't mean going back, she said carefully. It means starting from where we are now. Different people, different understanding. No guarantees it works. No guarantees, Gabriel agreed. Just two people who learn the hard way that covering wounds doesn't heal them. That trust has to be chosen, not proven. That some things are worth the risk of breaking. You're getting better at metaphors. I had a good teacher. He smiled, tentative, hopeful, human. She taught me that healing takes patience, that beauty can exist in broken things, that moving forward is braver than staying safe. Sierra looked at him for a long moment, seeing not the millionaire who'd doubted her or the man who'd made mistakes, but someone who'd finally learned that having a heart meant risking it, That feeling things was terrifying and necessary, and the only way to actually live. Okay, she said quietly, let's move forward, together, and see what that looks like. They walked out of the gallery side by side, not holding hands yet, not declaring anything, just existing in the same space with the same direction, learning what it meant to trust that the other person would still be there tomorrow, and the day after that, and eventually maybe long enough that the story stopped being about what broke them and started being about what they built afterward. Behind them, the painting hung in its gallery, the silent sun, finally completed, showing the world that some conversations span decades, that healing doesn't require erasing history, that the most beautiful art shows its cracks and calls them character. He had everything money could buy, except a heart, until she taught him the price of having one.